In January 1875, a cold wind swept across the Atlantic as a young man boarded a ship bound for California, carrying little more than a valise, a mind trained in the classics, and a telegram that had shattered his world. William Bowers Bourne was only 17 when the message arrived at Cambridge University. It had no comfort, no explanation, just urgency. Come home immediately. Your father is gone. The family fortune is collapsing. The empire you thought would last forever is crumbling under its own weight. He would return not to comfort, but to chaos. The grand house on Nob Hill, once the symbol of San Francisco's elite, now echoed with the silence of loss. The family's empire, built on gold, banking, and bold ambition, was on the verge of ruin. And at its center stood a teenager, completely unprepared for the weight that had just fallen on his shoulders. But what happened next was more than a story of wealth and rescue. It was the beginning of a dream so bold it seemed to defy time. A dream that ended not in triumph, but in 4 quiet graves. Today, people wander its gardens, unaware of the secrets buried beneath. The mansion stands, the flowers bloom, but the family is gone. Before we uncover how one of the most beautiful estates in America became the resting place of an empire. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this. Comment below where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. We love seeing this community grow across time zones. And if you're already intrigued by the mystery behind the title, share this video with someone who appreciates forgotten history. Let's see who really understands what "too beautiful to keep" means. William's father, William Bowers Bourne, had been one of the titans of the California gold rush. From humble beginnings, he'd clawed his way to wealth, investing in banks, insurance, shipping, and most crucially, in mines. He built a name that resonated across Nob Hill in San Francisco. The elder Bourne had acquired controlling interest in the Empire Mine in 1869. For a time, it glittered with promise. Gold poured from the earth. The family coffers grew fat, and young William had the privilege of studying abroad, untethered by the burdens of inheritance. That was supposed to be someone else's fate, until a single gunshot changed everything. In July 1874, William Bourne was alone in his study, cleaning a revolver. The gun discharged. Whether it was an accident or something darker, the coroner never decided, but the result was the same. The patriarch was dead. The estate was a labyrinth of liabilities. Every glittering investment was mortgaged against another. The Empire Mine, once their crown jewel, was failing. The deeper shafts flooded constantly, and the vein of gold looked exhausted. The financial empire that had seemed unshakable teetered on the edge of ruin. When William II stepped off the ship in San Francisco, he was no longer a student. He was the last hope of a dynasty. He was 22 when he officially took control of the estate's tangled remnants. But even in those early years, he possessed something that would define him: resolve. Others would have liquidated, sold off the mine for scraps, and abandoned the sinking ship. But William saw something others didn't. The mine wasn't barren. It was misunderstood. Mining engineers warned him. Anything below 1 in 200 feet was economic suicide. Water pressure increased. Rock was unstable, and the cost of pumping alone could destroy a fortune. William ignored them. He brought in his cousin, George Starr, a 19-year-old engineering prodigy. They began redesigning the mine from the ground up. They didn't just dig deeper, they thought smarter. They imported Cornish miners, men whose ancestors had worked the most treacherous shafts in England. They brought with them generations of hard rock mining wisdom, and most importantly, a toughness born in the bowels of the earth. New drilling equipment was installed. Innovative pumping systems fought back the encroaching water. The shafts crept down 200 feet, 500, 800. By 1884, gold returned. So did profits. By the end of its life, the Empire mine would yield nearly 6 million ounces of gold, making it one of the richest in California's history. But gold was only the beginning. William didn't just rebuild the family fortune. He created a stranglehold over a much more essential resource: water. As San Francisco's population boomed in the late 19th century, its natural water supply failed to keep pace. Springs dried up, wells went foul, and cholera outbreaks made every bucket suspect. Private companies sprang up like weeds, competing viciously for reservoirs, aqueducts, and distribution rights. Among them, one emerged victorious: the Spring Valley Water Company. And William, ever the tactician, began buying shares, quietly at first, then more aggressively. By 1898, William was president. He didn't just own the company. He controlled San Francisco's lifeblood. He owned the reservoirs. He decided who got water and at what price. He had the power of eminent domain, allowing him to seize land in the name of the public good, all while profiting privately. It was a legal monopoly, and it made him fantastically rich. But wealth came at a price. San Franciscans paid nearly 2.5 times more for water than Angelenos, who enjoyed city-owned systems. Editorials depicted him as an octopus strangling the city. Political cartoons painted him with tentacles wrapped around pipelines, squeezing families dry. And William? He didn't flinch. He believed in private enterprise. He believed he ran his company more efficiently than the government ever could. The pipes worked. The water flowed. San Francisco stayed hydrated and healthy. That was all that mattered. He knew the monopoly wouldn't last. City officials had already begun plans for an audacious project: damming the Hetch Hetchy Valley, 160 miles away in the Sierra Nevada, and bringing its water to the city. But that would take decades. In the meantime, William ruled. By 1914, William was 57. He had conquered the earth for gold and mastered its most essential element: water. His portfolio included not only the Empire Mine and Spring Valley, but also interests in gas utilities, railroads, banks, and real estate. He had homes in San Francisco and Grass Valley, and a massive estate in Ireland, Muckross House, gifted to his daughter Maud upon her marriage. But something was missing. Not in his holdings, those were unmatched, but in his heart. William began looking for land on the peninsula. Not just any land. Land with water, land with privacy, land with potential. The elite of San Francisco were already scattering to Burlingame, Hillsborough, and Atherton, building country retreats in the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake. These estates were grand, visible, and socially strategic. But William wanted seclusion, not spectacle. He found it in Woodside, 654 acres at the southern edge of Crystal Springs Reservoir, land his own company technically owned. It was the perfect loop of legacy. He would build a country estate not just on water, but above it. Literally. And he would name it Filoli. A strange name at first glance, but for William, it was sacred. A personal creed woven into a single word: fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. Filoli. It was a secret monument to his own values, etched into the soil he now owned. This land wasn't just his escape. It was his attempt to defy time. He wanted to grow young here, to build something not even death could touch. But beneath the oaks and springs, a truth loomed. The San Andreas Fault cut directly through the land. The same force that shattered San Francisco in 1906 ran like a scar beneath his future home. Most men would have recoiled. William simply studied it. He accepted its risk, just as he'd accepted water seepage in the mine and hostility in the press. The earth had always been dangerous. That was no reason not to build. By the end of 1914, he owned the land. The vision was clear. Now, all he needed was an architect who could bring it to life. To stand on the slope of Filoli's land in 1914 was to see both history and ambition spread beneath your feet. The estate William Bourne chose sat on the eastern flank of the Santa Cruz Mountains, overlooking the twin man-made reservoirs of Crystal Springs. But to William, it wasn't just a pretty view, it was a triumph. Those reservoirs existed because of his own company. That water flowed because of his empire. Now, in the quiet, undeveloped Woodside Hills, he found his final canvas. The region was still wild, threaded with creeks and lined with oak groves that had stood for centuries. Most saw raw, untamed land. William saw the bones of a masterpiece. He understood the topography intimately. As president of Spring Valley Water Company, he had surveyed the hills, traced the springs, and followed the courses of underground streams. He didn't just own this land. He understood its veins, its pulse, its secrets. While others raced to secure parcels in well-established enclaves like Hillsborough and Burlingame, William carved out a corner of his own hidden kingdom. Filoli's location wasn't accidental. It was far enough from the city to offer escape, but close enough for control. Just 30 miles south of San Francisco, an hour by car if the roads behaved, it allowed William to keep a firm grip on his business while cultivating peace. That balance mattered. Since the devastating earthquake of 1906, San Francisco had become a place of constant noise. Construction cranes, political protests, financial uncertainty. The Bourne's mansion on Webster Street had survived the fires, but the sense of safety hadn't. For many in William's social class, the city now felt like a fragile skeleton of what once was. The idea of building beyond the fault lines wasn't just appealing, it became necessary. The peninsula, with its cool breezes, fertile soil, and post-quake tranquility, became the answer. Railroads and automobiles had finally made it accessible. Wealthy families were planting country homes among the hills, building estates designed not just for retreat, but for self-sufficiency. The Crockers had already staked their claim. The Carolins had broken ground, but none of them had what William had: water, hundreds of acres, and complete isolation. The property he selected was, in a word, perfect. It sloped gently down toward the shimmering expanse of Crystal Springs, catching the golden California sun on its southern face. A variety of creeks crisscrossed the land, including one that traced the invisible path of the San Andreas Fault. Most men would have seen that as a threat. William saw it as nature's signature on the deed. Earthquakes were inevitable. What mattered was how you built, not where. He wanted more than a home. He envisioned a private world, fully functional, self-sustaining. Fruit orchards, flower gardens, livestock, a greenhouse. No detail was too small. Irrigation would come from the springs on the property, but if needed, He could draw from the very reservoir that lay below. It was a level of control few could dream of, and even fewer could afford. But William wasn't concerned with price. He was buying permanence, or at least the illusion of it. He and Agnes were not young anymore. At 57 and 53, their child-rearing years were behind them. Their only surviving daughter, Maud, was already married and living in Ireland. Filoli wouldn't be a playground for children. It would be a sanctuary, a stage for music, for gardening, for long conversations beneath ivy-covered walls. It would be the next phase of their life together. A place, in William's own words, to grow young again. The name he chose for the estate spoke volumes. Filoli. Filoli. A cryptic acronym born from a deeply personal credo. Fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. It was a private motto turned public emblem. To the unknowing, the name sounded vaguely Italian, elegant, foreign, sophisticated. But to William, it was a silent proclamation. He wasn't just building a home. He was building a legacy, one brick, one tree, one principle at a time. The land was ready. What he needed now was a visionary partner, an architect who could match his precision, his restraint, and his grandeur. He turned, as he often did, to a man who already understood him. Willis Polk. Polk was no ordinary architect. He had rebuilt San Francisco's financial district after the earthquake. He had designed banks, cathedrals, and private mansions. And more importantly, he had already worked for William. The Webster Street mansion bore Polk's signature. So did the Empire Cottage near Grass Valley. He knew William's tastes, his preference for elegance without ostentation, for substance over spectacle. And Polk respected William's intelligence. He was a rare client who asked hard questions, demanded sound engineering, and appreciated architectural subtlety. The call went out. Come to Woodside. See the land. Create something worthy of it. When Polk arrived, he stood on the same slope William had once surveyed. Before him lay rolling hills, shadowed groves of oak, sparkling water in the distance. He saw what William saw, potential. But he also saw something more. The land demanded horizontality. Vertical ambition would have clashed with its serenity. The house couldn't dominate the hill. It had to settle into it, like it had always been there. The vision began to take shape. Georgian revival, symmetry, balance, tradition. Brick facades that recalled colonial Virginia, grand enough to convey success, restrained enough to feel like home. Not a palace, but a principled masterpiece. The foundation of Filoli was not just cement and stone. It was memory, belief, and an unspoken war against the passing of time. William didn't simply want a place to retire. He wanted a fortress against mortality, a sanctuary where the years could slow down, where beauty and structure could triumph over entropy. The land had been selected. The values were clear, and now, with Polk's sketches beginning to bloom into architecture, the dream moved toward reality. But even as Polk put pencil to paper, nature reminded them of its constant presence. The San Andreas Fault slumbered beneath their feet, an ancient rupture stretching 800 miles through California, with the power to reduce everything to dust. It was the same fault that had broken San Francisco just 8 years earlier. Yet William, ever pragmatic, refused to be intimidated. You don't build to avoid the earth. You build to endure it. That would be Filoli's challenge and its legacy. By the time architect Willis Polk began sketching his designs for Filoli, he was a veteran of California's architectural rebirth. He had shaped San Francisco's skyline after the 1906 earthquake and understood that true grandeur didn't shout. It spoke in quiet, enduring lines. For William Bourne, Polk was more than a designer. He was a trusted interpreter of vision. Their past collaborations had proved that Polk knew how to turn ambition into stone, without ever betraying the land beneath it. The house Polk envisioned for Woodside wasn't merely a display of wealth. It was a conversation between man and landscape. The sprawling estate demanded a horizontal emphasis. It wasn't the time for towers or turrets. This house had to embrace the hills, not dominate them. Georgian revival became the style of choice, symmetrical, orderly, eternal. Polk knew it was the architecture of establishment, of deep roots and restrained power. In a state barely 70 years old, it was a deliberate gesture toward the traditions of older nations. But Polk was no copyist. He adapted the Georgian sensibility to California's light and geography. He chose red clay tiles for the roof, better suited to the climate than the slate of East Coast manors. He employed Flemish bond brickwork, a weaving of headers and stretchers that gave the walls texture and subtle rhythm. No surface was accidental. Even the mortar lines were part of the design. The layout centered around a transverse hall, a grand axis that ran east to west, creating a sequence of connected spaces. You could stand in the reception room and look through the drawing room into the dining room and beyond. Each room opened onto the next, a continuous line of vision that evoked European palaces. The enfilade was more than a design choice. It was a theatrical device, drawing the eye and the guest deeper into the experience of the house. The scale was substantial, 54,000 square feet, 56 rooms. But unlike the grotesque excesses of East Coast mansions, those with 100-foot ceilings and ballrooms that dwarfed cathedrals, Filoli was expansive yet intimate. The largest room, the ballroom, measured 70 by 32 feet, with a ceiling rising over 22 feet. Enough for 100 guests to dance comfortably, but still able to feel like a chamber concert hall. Every detail reflected care. The reception room, paneled in rich walnut, housed a sweeping staircase designed for both grandeur and grace. The drawing room, lighter in tone, used linen-covered walls and a scaled-down Carrara marble fireplace to create warmth. The dining room, clad in dark oak from floor to ceiling, was imposing yet grounded. A table for 24 guests sat at its heart, while carved moldings whispered of craftsmanship rarely seen today. The library was William's domain, lined with American black walnut and crowned with carved cornices. It was here he would conduct business, correspond with partners, and read in silence as Agnes played the piano in the adjacent ballroom. The space was a retreat within a retreat, a quiet engine room behind the estate's social performances. Construction began in 1915 and progressed with methodical precision. The terrain had to be sculpted into terraces. Foundations were poured with earthquake resistance in mind, an engineering necessity given the land's proximity to the San Andreas Fault. Materials came from both local sources and Bourne's own empire. Stone from the Empire Mine, the very ore-bearing rock that made his fortune, was used in the foundations and walls. It was poetic. The gold that once flowed from deep beneath the Sierra foothills would now quite literally hold up his final dream. Polk supervised the high-level vision, but left daily oversight to his trusted associates. He was juggling multiple commissions, including civic buildings and other private residences. But Filoli remained personal. It was, perhaps, one of the purest expressions of his architectural philosophy. Classic but never rigid. Elegant but never arrogant. Agnes, too, left her mark. An accomplished pianist and patron of the arts, she took a special interest in the ballroom's acoustics. She worked closely with craftsmen to ensure the ceiling and walls would carry music with clarity and warmth. The space would host chamber music performances, musical afternoons, and evenings when guests would gather in the glow of chandeliers while a quartet filled the air with Mozart or Schubert. Meanwhile, below stairs, a different kind of precision was taking shape. The service wing was as well planned as any grand room. The kitchen ceiling stood 17 feet high to disperse heat from the industrial stoves, a butler's pantry, equipped with a call board, walk-in safe for silver, and dumbwaiters, connected the kitchen to the dining room. It was a machine designed to power hospitality. Servants would operate in near invisibility, supporting every dinner, every recital, every summer garden party. Outside, pathways were laid out in anticipation of the gardens to come. Water systems were routed, not just for function but for beauty. Fountains, irrigation, and pools were part of the plan from the start. William's obsession with water, once a source of controversy in San Francisco, became an expression of elegance at Filoli. By late 1917, after nearly 2 years of intense work, the estate was complete. The final price tag exceeded $400,000, more than $10 million in today's terms, and yet, it was modest when compared to other Gilded Age estates like Hearst Castle or the Crocker Mansions. William hadn't built a fantasy or a fortress. He had built a statement, a house that belonged to its hillside as much as it belonged to him. In September, William and Agnes moved in. He was 60 years old. She was 56. Their daughter was thousands of miles away, living in Ireland. The halls of Filoli would not echo with children's footsteps. Instead, they would echo with music, conversation, and the quiet satisfaction of a dream fulfilled. William stood on the rear terrace, looking out over the slope toward the sparkling reservoirs. His reservoirs, his valley, his creation. The Empire mine still poured gold. The water company still ruled San Francisco. But Filoli was different. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about permanence. For a man who had spent his life mastering resources, first minerals, then water, Filoli was an attempt to master time itself. He had 5 good years before his body would begin to betray him. From the moment you stepped across the threshold of Filoli, you understood that this was not just a home. It was a performance. Everything about the space had been designed to evoke awe, admiration, and reverence. The grand reception room, 2 stories high, paneled in dark, polished walnut, rose like a cathedral to California wealth. Light from arched windows danced across the stair railings, glinting off the burnished surfaces as if to remind every guest, "You've entered somewhere rare." It was here that Agnes Bourne, dressed in silks and pearls, would welcome San Francisco society to the country estate. Dinner guests, chamber musicians, banking tycoons, opera benefactors, all ushered into an experience so meticulously choreographed. They likely forgot they were in the middle of the Santa Cruz Mountains and not a drawing room in London or Vienna. But that was the point. The moment you entered Filoli, you were no longer in California. You were in a dream, William Bourne's dream, made real. The enfilade design of the main floor, meant you could see through multiple rooms from a single vantage point. From the reception hall, your eyes were drawn forward through the drawing room into the dining room beyond and, if the doors were open, into the library. These sightlines weren't accidental. They were intentional invitations. Each space revealed only as much as it needed to, whispering of more elegance just out of reach. The drawing room softened the transition with linen-covered walls and refined details. A Carrara marble fireplace created a focal point, its scale slightly undersized to preserve intimacy. Fine furniture imported from Europe filled the space. Louis XVI chairs, lacquered tables, hand-stitched upholstery. It was a room where conversation flowed before the formality of dinner, a space for aperitifs, introductions, and soft music drifting from an unseen piano. And then came the dining room. If the reception room was power and the drawing room was grace, the dining room was dominance. Encased in dark-stained oak, with hand-carved moldings and a table that could comfortably seat 24, it was where William and Agnes demonstrated not just their wealth, but their place at the top of California's hierarchy. Every element had been considered. The spacing of the chairs, the angle of the candlelight, the acoustics of clinking silverware and quiet conversation. Dinner was not simply a meal, it was ritual, and it followed rules. Guests were placed according to rank and strategy. The seating chart, often devised by Agnes herself, served business interests as much as social ones. The conversations were as carefully curated as the menu, but nothing compared to the ballroom. It was Filoli's heart and Agnes's crown jewel. Measuring 70 feet in length and 32 feet wide, with a soaring 22.5-foot ceiling, it had the proportions of a European stateroom without the arrogance. The parquet floor, laid in quarter-sawn white oak, gleamed under chandeliers that descended like frozen fireworks. Massive structures of gilded bronze and hand-cut crystal modeled after Versailles, but scaled for the California context. They weren't mere reproductions. They were interpretations, artworks in their own right. The walls were painted a subtle water green, chosen to harmonize with the surrounding gardens visible through tall French windows. Gold leaf adorned the moldings. At one end of the ballroom, a fireplace of Baroque splendor stood in red Mecale marble, its ormolu decorations showing Hercules in battle with the Nemean lion, a symbol of strength and endurance. For Agnes, who had studied music seriously and performed as a pianist, this was more than an event space. It was a concert hall. Her grand piano stood near the windows. Chamber quartets were frequent guests. The acoustics, fine-tuned during the design process, allowed every note to float clearly through the room. She hosted musical evenings attended by San Francisco's cultural elite. Sometimes they gathered simply to listen, sometimes they danced, gliding across the floor in gowns and tails, their reflections flickering in the glass. For debutantes, this was a sacred place. For newlyweds, a dream venue. For bankers, a gilded negotiation chamber. But there was another world beneath the sparkle, one hidden from guests, but no less essential. The butler's pantry functioned as the nerve center between the grandeur of the dining room and the machine of the kitchen. It contained a walk-in silver safe, an electric call board to signal staff, and dumbwaiters for moving dishes discreetly between levels. The kitchen itself was vast and utilitarian, its 17-foot ceiling helping to manage the heat generated by industrial ovens. Meals for events were prepared with military efficiency, sometimes 9 per day when counting the separate schedules of family, guests, and staff. Behind the scenes, an army of workers kept Filoli running. As many as 35 servants, cooks, maids, groundskeepers, chauffeurs operated on staggered shifts. Most worked 14-hour days. Many lived in the south wing, in modest rooms with shared baths. Their lives were not luxurious. Their quarters were plain, functional, unadorned. Yet they formed the backbone of everything the guests saw. Without them, the chandeliers would not sparkle, the linen would not be crisp, and the food would not arrive on time. It was a strict hierarchy. Staff entered through separate doors. They traveled different hallways. Even their staircases were concealed. They were trained not just in service, but in invisibility. The illusion of effortless grandeur depended on their labor, and the Bournes, like most estate owners of the time, rarely acknowledged it publicly. Privilege was maintained through order, and order required silence below stairs. For a brief time, everything worked perfectly. William conducted business meetings in the walnut-paneled library. Agnes hosted musical salons in the ballroom. Guests wandered from terrace to terrace, dazzled by the gardens unfolding just beyond the windows. They marveled at the symmetry, the refinement, the perfection of it all. Filoli was a stage, and the Bournes were its leading actors. But every performance has its final act. In the summer of 1921, the music began to fade. William had been feeling strange, minor headaches, moments of confusion, stumbles he passed off as tiredness. Then one morning, he awoke and couldn't move the left side of his body. A stroke. Severe. The man who had built an empire with his own hands could no longer lift a spoon. The grandeur of Filoli remained. The rooms were still perfect. The gardens still bloomed. But the master of the house now looked at them from a wheelchair. The house, once a symbol of triumph, began its slow transformation into something else, a monument to what had been. While the walls of Filoli rose from the ground in orderly brick and Georgian geometry, another masterpiece was taking shape just beyond them. William Bourne had not envisioned merely a grand house. He wanted a landscape that spoke the same language as the architecture, a garden not of whimsy, but of structure, not nature in its wildness, but nature tamed, ordered, and placed into obedience. He sought formality, legacy, and permanence, and that meant one thing: a garden that could be controlled. In 1917, as the final fixtures were being set inside the house, William reached out to Bruce Porter, a man not easily defined. Porter was an artist, a muralist, a stained glass designer, a poet, and, perhaps most importantly in this case, a visionary of outdoor spaces. At 54, Porter had already become a central figure in the Bay Area's cultural world, having helped resurrect the San Francisco art scene after the 1906 earthquake. But it was his European education and appreciation for garden architecture, especially the formal styles of Italy and England, that made him the perfect candidate for Filoli. Porter walked the land with William. The site sloped gently uphill behind the house, creating a natural progression from structure to landscape, from civilization to cultivated wilderness. Porter saw the possibilities immediately. He imagined garden rooms enclosed by hedges and brick walls, leading one into the next, each with its own atmosphere but connected by a central axis. It was a design that evoked the Renaissance gardens of Tuscany and the arts and crafts estates of England. But this was California, and Porter would shape the land accordingly. His first act was architectural. He didn't think in flowers or color palettes. He thought in geometry. Garden walls, hedgerows, and sightlines became his tools. He carved the space into terraces, each higher than the last, leading upward from the sunken garden to the high place and the woodland paths beyond. Each room had a specific function: for strolling, for sitting, for entertaining, for contemplation. Some were meant to be discovered only by movement, turning a corner to find an enclosed orchard or a fountain's quiet trickle. But vision alone doesn't grow plants. For that, Porter turned to someone extraordinary, Isabella Warne, known to everyone as Bella, a woman ahead of her time. Bella was already respected across California for her deep horticultural knowledge and impeccable taste. She had no formal degree, but she had something better: an eye for beauty and a hands-on understanding of plants. Born into a wealthy San Francisco family ruined by bad mining investments, Bella had remade herself. Alongside her sisters, she had started a floral design firm, providing elaborate arrangements for the city's grandest events. Her reputation earned her a place at Filoli. Bella's role was to bring the garden to life. While Porter drew the skeleton, she chose the muscle, the flesh, the fragrance. She selected every plant, color, and texture, designing for seasonal transitions so that the garden would never feel static. It would evolve year-round, offering something new with each visit, but always within structure. The garden was never to be chaotic. Even the wildness had its boundaries. The centerpiece of the garden's formal portion was the sunken garden, the first major space one encountered upon stepping from the house's back terrace. A reflecting pool, 80 feet long, anchored the space. It wasn't just decorative. In a state where water had always symbolized power, and where William Bourne literally charged citizens by the gallon, this pool was a statement. 8,000 gallons of still, reflective water used for beauty, not survival. In a land of droughts and rationing, the message was unmistakable. Here, we control water. We use it to mirror the sky. Japanese yew hedges bordered the garden, clipped into geometric perfection. Twin olive trees flanked the pool. On either side, panels of lawn rolled out like green carpets. Bella softened the hard lines with flower beds filled with tulips, irises, and seasonal bulbs. She knew how to layer her colors: pastel in spring, vibrant in summer, warm in autumn, always ensuring contrast and harmony. As visitors ascended from the sunken garden, they moved through a sequence of walled enclosures. Porter had designed these walls not just to structure space, but to manipulate microclimates. Sheltered from wind and fog, the gardens could host more delicate plants. Bella used this to her advantage, planting espalier fruit trees, hybrid roses, and rare perennials that would have failed in exposed conditions. One of William's most specific requests was a connection to Ireland, specifically to Muckross House, the Irish estate he had purchased for his daughter Maud. Muckross was surrounded by ancient yew trees, their columnar forms standing like sentinels across the estate. William arranged for cuttings to be taken from those trees and transported back to California. They were propagated at his cottage in Grass Valley and then planted at Filoli. Bella incorporated more than 200 Irish yews into the design. These vertical evergreens became structural elements, forming allays and framing key pathways. It was a living link between father and daughter, between two continents, between two dreams. By 1922, the skeleton and skin of the garden were in place. The hedges were young, but the form was visible. The paths had been laid, the walls built, the reflecting pool filled. Bella continued refining the plantings, She visited frequently, making adjustments, replacing failures, introducing new species. It was her canvas, and she painted with chlorophyll and bloom. The work was relentless. Formal gardens don't maintain themselves. Hedges required weekly clipping. Deadheading flowers was a daily task. Weeding was constant. 12 full-time gardeners were employed by the late 1920s. The head gardener, Louis Mariconi, lived on site and would continue working at Filoli for 5 decades. Under Bella's supervision, the gardens became known across the peninsula as some of the most beautiful in the state. The garden was not an escape from reality. It was a curated version of it. Nature, but edited. Life, but ordered. To walk its paths was to enter a world where human will reigned supreme. In many ways, it was the physical embodiment of William Bourne's life philosophy. He had tamed minds, commanded water, and bent the land to his will. Now, in this garden, he had created something eternal, or so he believed. But even paradise has its shadows. In the summer of 1921, just as the garden began blooming in earnest, William suffered the stroke that would end his mobility. He would never again walk through the spaces he had designed. Instead, each morning, staff would wheel him to a specific spot at the garden's high point. From there, he could look down across the terraces, through the hedgerows, past the reflecting pool and formal lawns, all the way to the house below. And beyond that, beyond the gardens, beyond the walls, he could see the reservoirs sparkling in the sun. His reservoirs, his valley, his empire. But the paths were now out of reach. The garden had become a view, not a world. Beauty endured, but access had slipped from his hands. In the most structured, controlled space he had ever created, William Bourne was suddenly powerless. For most of his life, William Bourne poured his energy into empires of industry, mines, monopolies, architecture, and gardens. But nothing he built was more personal, more delicate, than the relationship he shared with his only surviving child, Maud. Born in 1883, after the tragic death of a newborn son, Maud became the axis around which William and Agnes's hopes spun. Raised in the Bourne mansion on Webster Street, educated by private tutors, steeped in music and languages, she grew into the image of refinement expected of a daughter of the Gilded Age elite. She was not just loved, she was cherished. By 1910, Maud was 26, dangerously close to what society considered spinsterhood. Her parents, particularly Agnes, watched anxiously. The daughter of San Francisco's wealthiest water baron could not simply remain unmarried, and her future needed to reflect her class, her upbringing, her father's pride. That spring, at a social function that blurred business and aristocracy, Maud met Arthur Rose Vincent, a gentleman from County Clare, Ireland. Arthur was 44, 18 years her senior, and had already been married once. He came from Anglo-Irish stock, land rich but cash poor. Like so many families clinging to their estates amid the slow decay of the British Empire's outer edges, the match was practical, if not wildly romantic. Arthur offered lineage and prestige. Maud offered wealth and vitality. Her parents approved. The wedding took place in March 1910 at St. Dominic's Church in San Francisco. It was a grand event, covered in the newspapers, a showcase of Bourne wealth and status. But William's wedding gift would overshadow everything else. He bought them an entire estate, Muckross House, located in County Kerry, Ireland. Muckross was a 19th-century Tudor-style mansion nestled between lakes and mountains in the Killarney region. Its grounds were ancient, magnificent, 11,000 acres of forests, gardens, and sweeping views. It had once belonged to nobility, and now it would be Maud's. William purchased the estate outright, a gesture not just of generosity but of symbolic intent. His daughter would not simply marry into Irish society. She would reign over a property worthy of her station. To support the estate, William arranged for an annual stipend of $65,000, a staggering amount at the time, plus a $25,000 allowance for Maud and Arthur's personal expenses. He spared no expense ensuring that Muckross would operate at full capacity, including its staff, gardens, stables, and entertainment obligations. If Arthur's aristocratic blood gave Maud access, it was William's money that made the fantasy real. For William, Muckross was more than a gift. It was a spiritual counterpart to what he was building in California. He visited the estate several times, walking its gardens, observing the design of its formal spaces, absorbing the sense of generational permanence it exuded. Ireland, with its moody skies and deep green hills, offered something Filoli could not: antiquity. Muckross had roots that stretched back centuries. William began to see it as an ancestral parallel, a second axis for his family's legacy, planted on another continent, and the connection was not symbolic alone. William instructed his horticulturists to take cuttings from the towering Irish yews that lined Muckross's walkways. These cuttings were transported across the Atlantic, then nurtured in the greenhouses at Empire Mine Cottage in Grass Valley. Once matured, they were planted at Filoli, forming the living spine of the estate's formal garden paths. These yews, solemn and upright, stood as sentinels linking father and daughter, California and Kerry, the New World and the Old. Every time William walked the garden paths at Filoli, he was, in a way, walking beside Maud. But that walk came to an end in the summer of 1921. William, now 64, awoke one morning feeling wrong. His speech was slurred, his left side numb. A doctor was summoned from San Francisco. The diagnosis was swift and devastating: a severe stroke. William survived, but he would never recover. His mobility was compromised, his speech hindered, his independence lost. For a man who had lived in motion, managing mines, surveying watersheds, building empires, the wheelchair was a cruel confinement. He could no longer travel to Muckross. Ireland was too far, the voyage too taxing. But he needed to see it again, somehow. In 1921, he commissioned American artist Ernest Peixoto to paint murals for Filoli's ballroom. Peixoto, well known for his impressionistic style and experience capturing European landscapes, was the perfect choice. William gave him photographs, descriptions, memories. From these, Peixoto created large-scale murals of Muckross and its surrounding countryside. Blue lakes beneath gray skies, deep forests under clouds. The house itself standing resolute on the edge of wilderness. The murals were installed along the ballroom walls that same year. And now, when William was wheeled into the grand room where Agnes still played piano, he could gaze upon Ireland. He could see, in paint and memory, the estate he had given his daughter, the place he had dreamed of revisiting. He would never walk through Muckross again, but the idea of it remained close, on his walls, in his garden, in the trees that had journeyed across an ocean. Maud, now known as Maud Vincent, continued living in Ireland, visiting her parents at Filoli when transatlantic travel permitted. But the journey was long, by train to the coast, by ship across the sea, and another train ride from New York to California. These visits grew less frequent as time passed, and William's condition worsened. Still, Maud wrote often. She sent photographs, updates from the estate, clippings from the Killarney press, and then, in November 1929, a telegram arrived. Maud had been sailing back to Ireland from a visit to New York. Somewhere during the voyage, she fell ill, fever, coughing, fatigue. By the time the ship reached port, pneumonia had taken hold. She died shortly after disembarking. She was just 45 years old. Agnes made the trip to collect her daughter's body. William, too weak to travel, remained at Filoli, unable to say goodbye. Maud was brought home and buried in the small family cemetery on the estate, beside the infant brother who had died decades before. Her grave, shaded by trees, invisible to the public eye, completed a circle that began with a wedding and a gift of land. A piece of Ireland had come to California, and now a part of California would forever hold its daughter. In the months after Maud's death, William began quietly dismantling the empire. The Empire mine was sold to Newmont Mining. He accelerated negotiations to sell Spring Valley Water Company to the city of San Francisco. The man who had once controlled gold and water, who had built Filoli and gifted Muckross, began letting go. His daughter's death had cut the last tether holding him to ambition, and yet, the yews still stood. The murals still hung. The garden paths still echoed with memories. William sat at the top of the terrace most mornings, wheeled there by staff, gazing down the central axis of his creation, through hedges, past fountains, toward the house, and farther still, toward the valley and the reservoir beyond. He looked upon his kingdom, now quieted, now grieving. The Irish connection that had once represented legacy and pride had become a source of sorrow. The gardens were still perfect, the vision still intact. But the daughter they were meant to honor was gone. And so, slowly, William began to fade. The summer of 1921 had begun like so many others at Filoli, with sunlight pouring over the hills, roses blooming in ordered bursts, and guests filtering in for dinner parties and music-filled evenings. The gardens were maturing into their intended splendor, hedges clipped to perfection, and terraces warmed by the late California sun. William, though aging, was still active. He remained involved in the management of his business empire, dictating letters from the library, reviewing ledgers, and hosting associates in the formal rooms of his estate. Agnes, always gracious, managed the house and played the piano in the ballroom where guests would gather in admiration. Filoli was functioning exactly as they had intended. And then, one morning, everything changed. William didn't rise from bed at his usual time. When the housekeeper knocked, there was no response. Agnes entered the room to find him partially conscious, slumped, his speech garbled, and his left arm unresponsive. Panic rose, and a physician was summoned immediately from San Francisco. In the quiet urgency that followed, William was diagnosed with a cerebrovascular accident, a severe stroke, the kind that silences motion but leaves the mind painfully aware. The initial days were filled with uncertainty. Doctors could offer little more than comfort. There were no clot-busting drugs, no rehabilitation regimens as we know them now, just rest, observation, and hoped that another stroke would not follow. William survived, but the damage was irrevocable. His left side was permanently weakened, and walking became impossible. His speech remained slurred for months, improving only slightly over time. He retained his mental clarity, which, in many ways, made it worse. He was fully conscious of what he had lost. For a man who had built empires through movement, who had walked mine shafts, hiked reservoir lines, and strode through his gardens with pride, the wheelchair became a prison. Doors that once opened effortlessly now had to be widened. Ramps were built where stairs had stood. Servants adjusted their schedules, learning how to bathe, dress, and lift the man who had once managed thousands. Dignity eroded slowly, not all at once, but in pieces. The inability to descend the stairs, the reliance on a nurse's hand, the realization that even writing a letter required assistance. Agnes, who had stood beside him through triumph and tragedy, now became his daily companion in an entirely new way. She oversaw not only the household, but William's care, managing staff, adjusting the routines, making decisions when he could not. Her strength, once expressed through grace and hospitality, now emerged in quiet endurance. She walked the gardens each morning, then returned to describe them to William in exquisite detail. What had bloomed, what needed pruning, how the Irish yews looked in the light. Her words became his eyes, and always. Every morning, staff would wheel him to his favorite spot, the garden's highest terrace, where he could look down across the entire estate. From this perch, he could see it all. The sunken garden reflected the sky in its still pool. The hedges, once saplings, now stood tall. The allées formed their intended lines. Beyond the house, the reservoirs gleamed, his reservoirs, still fed by the watersheds he had secured decades earlier. It was a kingdom he had built, and one he could now only observe. Despite his confinement, William remained involved in what he could. Business associates traveled to Filoli for meetings. He would sit in the library, surrounded by dark walnut and the smell of old books, listening and occasionally speaking in slow, precise sentences. Reports were read aloud to him. He gave instructions, approved decisions. But gradually, his involvement waned. With each passing year, the boundaries of his world shrank, from empire to estate, from garden to room, from words to silence. Agnes did what she could to preserve the rhythm of their life. She continued hosting small events, garden clubs, music salons, charitable teas. These were scaled-back affairs, meant to maintain appearances but also to provide William with glimpses of the social life they once enjoyed. Guests were carefully chosen. Invitations were discreet. Even in decline, Filoli had an image to uphold. Behind the scenes, the staff adapted. Routines were built around William's needs. His wheelchair was polished daily. Blankets were warmed and folded with precision. The terrace had to be cleared each morning, lest any leaves interfere with the view. The gardener, Mariconi, ensured the paths were always tidy, the yews clipped, the beds bursting with color. It was as if the estate itself refused to let go of its purpose, to comfort, to impress, to endure. But William knew what was coming. He had read enough ledgers to recognize a dwindling column. He began preparing for the inevitable. Maud's death in 1929 after a sudden illness during an Atlantic voyage struck the final blow. The telegram arrived in the library. Agnes read it aloud. Their only child, dead from pneumonia in Manhattan, on her way back to Ireland. The shock was immense. William, already diminished by nearly a decade of illness, simply bowed his head, too frail to attend the funeral. He remained in his chair as Agnes traveled east to accompany Maud's body back to California. The burial took place in the family cemetery on the Filoli grounds, beside the infant son lost decades before. 4 graves now, with space for 2 more. After Maud's death, something in William shifted. He stopped engaging in business. He began selling off assets. The Empire mine was divested. Negotiations accelerated to transfer the Spring Valley Water Company to the city of San Francisco. In 1930, the city purchased the company for $41 million. The empire he had spent his life building, mines, water systems, monopolies, was being dismantled by his own hand. Agnes, now in her 70s, continued walking the gardens. She would sit beside William each morning, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just holding his hand. They had been married for nearly 50 years. Most of those years had been golden. The last 10 had been silver, dull in shine, but still strong, still binding. In January 1936, Agnes fell ill. The nature of her illness remains unclear. Possibly pneumonia, possibly a quiet failure of the heart. She died on January 20th, at the age of 75, in the home she had shaped with music, hospitality, and unwavering devotion. William was now alone. His daughter buried. His wife gone. His house, a 56-room monument to ambition, quiet and cavernous. 6 months later, on July 5th, 1936, William Bourne II died at Filoli. The cause was listed as complications from long-term paralysis and repeated strokes. He was 78. He was buried beside Agnes and Maud, beneath the trees in a cemetery that most visitors to Filoli will never see. 4 graves in total. William, Agnes, Maud, and the infant son from 1882. They form the true heart of the estate, silent beneath the soil, surrounded by the gardens they envisioned, tended by strangers who walk the same paths William once did, first with vigor, later with wheels. Filoli was built to celebrate life, to preserve vitality, to grow young. But by 1936, it had become something else entirely. A garden of memory, a mansion of loss, a monument to a family line that ended in silence. By the end of 1936, Filoli was no longer a living estate in the way William Bourne had envisioned it. The house still stood with its proud Georgian lines. The garden still bloomed in layered symmetry, and the reservoir still shimmered in the valley below. But the people who had given it meaning were gone. William Bowers Bourne II, his wife Agnes, their daughter Maud, and an infant son, buried quietly on the grounds, away from public paths, hidden beneath trees, and shielded by hedges, formed the estate's silent core. Without direct heirs, the question of Filoli's future loomed. The Bournes had no surviving children, and Maud and Arthur Vincent had produced no descendants during their years in Ireland. The estate, once built to host the elite, was now a mausoleum wrapped in topiary. There were no grandchildren to inherit its legacy, no family members eager to take on a 654-acre property with soaring maintenance costs and an aging infrastructure. The mansion was immense, but its grandeur was matched by the weight of its upkeep. Filoli, at that point, was rare, not just in scale but in its completeness. While many Gilded Age estates had already begun fragmenting, sold off in pieces or lost to taxes and neglect, Filoli had remained untouched. It was, in every sense, a self-contained world. Yet the same completeness that made it extraordinary also made it a burden. Few individuals had the resources or the will to take it on. In 1937, the estate went quietly on the market. No advertisements, no public showings, only whispers among the very wealthy, circulated through attorneys and discreet brokers. Potential buyers came and went, intrigued but cautious. The house was magnificent. The gardens were unrivaled, and the land vast. But the cost of preserving all of it was staggering. Most visitors envisioned carving the estate into parcels, selling off lots, converting the mansion into an institution or a retreat. Filoli, as a singular vision, was too grand, too specific, too much. Then came the Roths. William P. Roth and his wife, Lurline Matson Roth, visited Filoli that same year. They were no strangers to California's elite. Lurline was the daughter of Captain William Matson, the founder of the Matson Navigation Company, famous for its fleet of white-hulled steamships that sailed between San Francisco and Hawaii. Upon Captain Matson's death in 1917, Lurline inherited a substantial fortune. Her husband William, known as Bill, eventually became president of the company. The Roths were not looking for just another country home. They already owned property, but when they visited Filoli, something about it resonated. Lurline walked the gardens slowly, absorbing the symmetry, the seasonal beds, the clipped yews. She was not a casual admirer of flowers. She was a knowledgeable gardener, familiar with planting zones, microclimates, and soil conditions. She understood what it took to maintain such beauty. And, perhaps more importantly, she understood its fragility. The Roths purchased Filoli later that year. The price was never publicly disclosed. What mattered was that they didn't buy it to change it. They bought it to continue it. Lurline approached the estate with reverence. She saw herself not as a new owner, but as a steward. Much of the original furniture had been sold off in the months following William's death. The house was largely empty, but the bones were intact. The murals still adorned the ballroom. The wood paneling glowed in the dining room. The reception hall's staircase still curved with grace. Lurline worked with decorators to refurnish the home in period-appropriate pieces, creating a sense of lived-in elegance without theatricality. But it was in the gardens where she truly left her mark. Incredibly, Isabella Bella Warne, the original horticulturist who had worked with Bruce Porter to bring the gardens to life, was still alive in 1937 and still consulting on high-end projects. Lurline reached out to Bella, inviting her back to Filoli. What followed was one of the rarest continuities in estate history. A garden designed by one visionary was maintained and expanded by the very same person, decades later, under the guidance of a new but equally committed owner. Bella and Lurline formed a formidable team. While the Bournes had focused on architectural balance and formality, Lurline wanted more layers, greater biodiversity, more color, and an expanded palette of plantings that could surprise and delight. She was particularly fond of camellias, azaleas, and rhododendrons, plants that thrived in the peninsula's climate. Bella knew how to integrate these without disturbing the garden's structure. They turned their attention to the woodland garden, the least formal and most atmospheric area of the estate. Here, under the dappled shade of native oaks, they introduced ferns, foxgloves, bleeding hearts, and other shade-loving species that gave the garden depth and seasonal mystery. Paths were laid with intention, allowing visitors to feel as though they were wandering a forest, even as every curve was calculated. In 1946, A swimming pool was added, but even this was done with restraint. Lurline insisted that it harmonize with the surrounding landscape. Bella designed the plantings around it, including the transplantation of mature Irish yews to provide a dramatic backdrop. Moving trees of that size was risky, but it succeeded. The result was a pool area that felt timeless, as if it had always been part of the original garden plan. By the 1950s, Filoli was once again a functioning country estate, not a relic, not a museum, but a home. Bill Roth suffered a stroke during this decade, and the pool he and Lurline had built became a place for his therapy. He died in 1963. Lurline, now widowed at 70, remained at Filoli. For the next 12 years, she tended it as carefully as one tends a manuscript. She continued gardening, hosting, walking the paths, pruning branches, correcting details. The house was her sanctuary. The gardens were her life. But Lurline was pragmatic. She saw the cultural changes sweeping across America. The age of private estates was ending. Post-war economics and shifting values made such properties unsustainable for most families. Filoli could not become just another estate lost to time, divided and buried beneath suburban sprawl. It had to be preserved. She knew there was only one way to guarantee its future. In 1975, Lurline Matson Roth donated the entire Filoli estate, house, gardens, and land, to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The gift included not just the structures, but a substantial endowment to help cover ongoing maintenance. Her reason, when asked, was simple and definitive. Filoli is too beautiful to be private. With that act, the estate passed from private vision to public legacy. What William Bourne had built to secure his family's place in history would now belong to everyone. And while he may never have imagined such an outcome, the spirit of his creation, the balance, the order, the beauty, would live on. 4 graves still sit on the estate, tucked away, unseen by the tens of thousands who visit each year. William, Agnes, Maud. The infant son lost in 1882. They do not speak, but Filoli speaks for them. In walls, in water, in gardens that continue to bloom exactly as they once dreamed. When Lurline Matson Roth took possession of Filoli in 1937, she stepped into more than just a mansion. She inherited a vision, one constructed out of symmetry and silence, granite and grief. But what she brought to the estate wasn't just preservation, it was resurrection. The Roths didn't purchase Filoli to make it something new. They purchased it to let it continue breathing. Lurline came from a world of precision and purpose. Her father, Captain William Matson, had transformed a single sailing vessel into a powerful Pacific shipping empire. The Matson Navigation Company dominated the trade routes between San Francisco and Hawaii, ferrying goods, passengers, and dreams across vast ocean waters. From her father, Lurline inherited more than wealth. She inherited discipline, vision, and a profound respect for structure. These would serve her well in the decades to come at Filoli. With her husband, William P. Roth, Lurline brought life back to the estate, one room, one hedge, one conversation at a time. The house had been partially stripped of its contents following the Bourne family's deaths, but the architecture remained unbroken, like a stage waiting for its cast to return. The ballroom still echoed faintly with the notes of chamber music, and the sun still painted the oak paneling in the dining room gold each morning. The Roths were not flamboyant. They hosted, but not extravagantly. Their gatherings were warm rather than ostentatious, often centered around garden walks, quiet dinners, or philanthropic discussions. Lurline particularly loved showing guests the gardens, not with a tour guide's detachment, but with a gardener's pride. She would kneel to touch the soil, pull a weed mid-conversation, or stop to inspect a blossom's color. She knew the names of plants not from labels but from memory. Isabella Warren, now in her late 60s, returned to Filoli as Lurline's gardening partner. Their collaboration marked a remarkable continuity. Warren had helped create the garden's original layout under William Bourne, and now she worked with its new caretaker to build upon that foundation. They expanded the planting palette beyond the strict formality of the original garden rooms, adding depth and variety, especially in the woodland areas. Shade-loving plants, hellebores, trilliums, bleeding hearts, were nestled beneath the oaks. Color and texture became layered, nuanced, ever-evolving. Lurline loved camellias, particularly those that bloomed in winter. With Warren's help, she introduced dozens of varieties into Filoli's gardens. Rhododendrons and azaleas soon followed. Their blooms brought the kind of ephemeral beauty that reminded visitors. This estate may have been born of order, but it lived in change. Even as the garden adhered to formal lines, it began to breathe in more deeply, more freely. Though the Roths remained low profile in public life, their influence was quietly significant. Bill Roth continued to lead Matson navigation through periods of both innovation and challenge. In private, however, his health declined. Like William Bourne before him, Bill eventually suffered a stroke. The pool that Lurline had added to the estate in 1946, carefully situated so it blended with the surrounding garden rooms, became part of his rehabilitation. He swam there regularly, gliding through water that reflected the hues imported decades earlier from Ireland. He died in 1963. Lurline, then 70 years old, continued alone at Filoli. Many assumed she would sell. Others expected the estate to pass to one of the Roths' 3 children. But Lurline had already made up her mind. She would stay. She would tend. And most importantly, she would plan for what would come next. The 1960s and 70s brought social transformations that few private estates could survive. The Gilded Age aesthetic, once admired, was now often seen as a symbol of inequality. Large estates were broken up, mansions turned into schools, retreat centers, or leveled entirely. Lurline watched it happen across the peninsula. She saw neighboring estates fall to developers, their gardens bulldozed, their libraries emptied. She knew Filoli could not survive as a private property indefinitely, but she also knew it deserved to survive. It was intact, authentic, layered with memory. And more than that, it was beautiful. Beauty, Lurline believed, carried responsibility. In the early 1970s, she began confidential discussions with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It was not an easy decision. The trust, based in Washington, D.C., had never before acquired a West Coast property of this size and complexity. Maintenance costs were enormous. The gardens required year-round staffing. The house needed ongoing preservation work. Even the plumbing had its peculiarities. Could it work? Could a national organization care for Filoli the way she had? Lurline didn't rush. She negotiated. She stipulated. And ultimately, she endowed. She understood that preservation required more than sentiment. It required cash. When the donation was finalized in 1975, it wasn't just the house and the land that passed into public hands. It was a legacy. Along with it came a substantial financial endowment to support operations in perpetuity. When asked by a reporter why she had given away the most beautiful estate in California, Lurline answered with the clarity that defined her life. Filoli is too beautiful to be private. It was not a gift. It was a declaration. In that moment, Filoli transitioned from personal retreat to public treasure. The National Trust took over operations and prepared the estate for visitors. Interpretive materials were created, tours were designed, staff were hired. But they didn't change the estate's soul. They didn't alter the garden rooms or repaint the ballroom murals. They preserved them. Lurline moved to a smaller home nearby but returned often. She was no ghost haunting her former property. She was a gardener checking in on her plants. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible to most guests. But staff knew. Gardeners still deferred to her opinions. And when a bed didn't bloom quite right, she'd gently suggest what might grow better there next year. In 1985, Lurline passed away. She had lived long enough to see Filoli flourish as a historic site. She had seen strangers walk the paths she once planted. She had watched the vision of William and Agnes Bourne survive, not as a relic, but as a living, evolving place. Her fingerprints were in the soil, in the hedgerows, in the camellias that still bloom each winter. The Roth legacy is not in monuments or plaques. It is in continuity. It is in the fact that Filoli didn't just survive the 20th century. It expanded into the 21st. Lurline understood something profound. Beauty, once created, demands stewardship. And sometimes, the greatest act of ownership is letting go. In 1975, when Filoli opened to the public for the first time under the National Trust for Historic Preservation, it was still largely unknown beyond California's horticultural circles and a few dedicated historians. Visitors trickled in, drawn by whispers of a Georgian mansion surrounded by formal gardens that seemed more suited to the English countryside than the Santa Cruz Mountains. The estate had survived 2 family dynasties and a cultural shift that had destroyed most of its peers. But its most unexpected transformation was just beginning. Filoli was about to become famous in a way no one could have predicted, not through history books, but through Hollywood. 3 years after its public opening, in 1978, a film crew rolled through Filoli's gates. Director Warren Beatty was preparing to shoot Heaven Can Wait, a romantic fantasy comedy about a man given a second chance at life. The story required a setting that could pass as celestial, an estate so grand, so perfectly composed, that it could plausibly be mistaken for heaven itself. Beatty's location scouts visited dozens of mansions across the country. But when they arrived at Filoli, the decision was immediate. This wasn't just luxury. It was timelessness. Scenes from Heaven Can Wait were filmed in the ballroom and the gardens. The mansion, framed in golden California light, appeared to float above reality. Audiences who saw the film might not have known the name of the estate, but they felt its presence. It was the dream of wealth, serenity, and unreachable elegance, captured in wide cinematic sweeps. The film went on to receive 9 Academy Award nominations and reached audiences across the world. For the first time, Filoli wasn't just a historical site. It was a cultural symbol. But its greatest surge in fame came not from the silver screen, but from television. In 1981, ABC premiered Dynasty, a nighttime soap opera built to rival CBS's Dallas, centered on the Carrington family. a fictional oil dynasty based in Denver. Dynasty quickly became a sensation. Viewers tuned in weekly to watch betrayals, boardroom power plays, and champagne-fueled confrontations in lavish settings. And every episode began the same way, with an aerial shot of a grand estate. The Carrington Mansion, that estate was Filoli. Helicopter cameras swooped over the formal gardens, the symmetrical hedgerows, and the red brick mansion that gleamed like old money. Though the show never filmed interior scenes at the estate, the interiors were sets built in Los Angeles. The exterior shots burned themselves into the minds of millions. Over 200 episodes later, Filoli had become synonymous with the idea of American aristocracy. It no longer mattered that it was in California, not Colorado. It no longer mattered that its original owner had been a water baron, not an oil magnate. To viewers around the world, Filoli was the house of power. The impact was immediate and measurable. Attendance surged. Tour guides reported visitors from across the globe, particularly Asia, where Dynasty had become an unexpected hit. Japanese and Chinese tourists arrived in droves, many unable to pronounce Filoli, but instantly recognizing the estate from the screen. The gift shop adapted, offering subtle nods to the show's popularity without cheapening the estate's image. Even as the trust maintained historical interpretation, it could not ignore the influence television had bestowed upon the place. But unlike many properties used as filming locations, Filoli didn't lose itself to Hollywood. It wasn't overrun by branding or altered for production needs. The National Trust was careful, requiring film crews to work within strict preservation guidelines. No sets were built on site. No walls were painted. Filoli, even as a star, remained herself. Other productions followed. In 1993, the Joy Luck Club, based on Amy Tan's best-selling novel, used Filoli's gardens for pivotal scenes. Its atmosphere, lush, restrained, and steeped in quiet emotion, matched the film's tone. Commercials and television series came and went, each using the estate for different effects. To sell perfume, to create nostalgia, to evoke elite sophistication. Through it all, the estate remained open to the public. Unlike the fictional Carrington Mansion, Filoli could be visited. You could walk the same paths seen on screen, step into the ballroom that had once stood in for heaven, or rest in the orchard, where a camera had once panned to capture spring in bloom. The illusion of film dissolved into the tangible reality of gravel underfoot and the scent of roses in the air. What made Filoli's screen life so fascinating wasn't just the beauty, it was the contrast. On screen, it became a symbol of power, of wealth weaponized in family feuds and dynastic plots. But in truth, Filoli was a place shaped by grief, by legacy, and by acts of preservation. William Bourne had built it as a retreat from the city, a place to grow young. Lurline Roth had saved it from the fate of most estates not through vanity, but because she believed some places belonged to everyone. And that's the irony. Filoli's fame came from its association with exclusivity, but its preservation came from generosity. As Dynasty entered pop culture history, and Heaven Can Wait aired again and again on television, Filoli's dual identity deepened. It was both real and unreal. A physical place with gardens that needed pruning and windows that required washing, and an idea projected onto screens. The dream of a perfect life, free from interruption, built on power and beauty. By the early 2000s, the television fame had faded slightly, but the impact endured. Filoli became one of the most visited historic house museums on the West Coast. Its gardens were recognized internationally. Conferences were held on site. Educational programs brought in school children who had never seen Dynasty, but who gasped all the same when they stepped into the ballroom or wandered through the rose garden. For some visitors, Filoli will always be the Dynasty house. For others, it's the garden with the reflecting pool. And for a few, it's the place where those murals of Ireland hang in the ballroom. All are correct. Filoli has lived many lives, and none of them cancel out the others. Its time on screen gave it something no plaque or tour guide could provide: myth. The kind of myth that turns architecture into aspiration. That gives history a heartbeat. And in that myth, William and Agnes Bourne live on, not as characters on a screen, but as the people who created the setting, who filled the rooms, who dreamed of permanence even as time slipped away. Today, Filoli stands not only as a preserved relic of California's Gilded Age, but as a living monument to what it means to build, to lose, and to let go. Each year, over 400,000 visitors walk through its gates. Some come with cameras, others with notebooks, some with only the vague memory of seeing it once on television. But nearly all leave with the same reaction: wonder. Because Filoli is not merely beautiful, it is serenity made visible. A space so carefully designed and painstakingly maintained that it feels removed from time. In spring, 75,000 bulbs erupt in choreographed color: tulips, daffodils, hyacinths, layered in bands of warmth and light. By summer, the roses dominate the walled garden while salvia and zinnias flash their colors under the California sun. Fall brings a quiet richness: chrysanthemums blooming beneath amber leaves. In winter, camellias bloom beneath the old oaks, reminders that life pulses even in the cold. Each season at Filoli is a different chapter in a never-ending story. One where the plants are characters as vivid as the people who once lived among them. The horticultural staff, modern heirs to Bella Warne and Lurline Roth, work from historical photographs, oral histories, and detailed planting records to maintain continuity. Their task is not just gardening, it is preservation through precision. The estate's identity is rooted in its formality, and every clipped hedge and framed sightline continues the vision first laid out over a century ago. Inside, the house serves not as a museum in the traditional sense, but as a narrative space. The reception hall still echoes with the imagined rustle of gowns and the hush of pre-dinner conversations. The dining room, with its dark paneling and quiet grandeur, looks much as it did when William Bourne hosted titans of business beneath its gilded moldings. The ballroom, with Ernest Peixoto's murals of Muckross and its surrounding Irish landscape, still whispers of William's longing and loss. That room, once the heart of Agnes's musical gatherings, occasionally fills again with music, modern concerts that echo her 1920s chamber performances. Filoli is no longer a private retreat for one family's power. It has become public space, owned by the National Trust, funded through donations, memberships, admission tickets, and the kind of daily dedication that once came only from full-time servants. In this way, it is democratic, built from elite wealth, maintained by collective effort, and yet, it is honest about its origins. Modern interpretive programs do not flinch from the truth. Visitors learn that Filoli's creation depended on enormous private wealth accumulated through monopoly, resource extraction, and labor. William Bourne controlled San Francisco's water supply. He charged high prices and was condemned for it in editorial cartoons. His empire mine generated millions in gold, but at the cost of laborers who worked in dangerous, dark conditions for low wages. The estate's elegant functions depended on 14-hour days from maids, cooks, chauffeurs, and gardeners, many of whom lived in tight quarters with little rest. Filoli does not pretend to be a utopia. It acknowledges its contradictions. Beauty here coexists with power. Grace lives next to grief. Wealth built the house, but it could not prevent tragedy. William built Filoli to grow young, yet it became the place where his daughter died. His wife faded, and he was wheeled in silence to overlook what he could no longer touch. And still, the gardens bloom. Filoli also acknowledges what came before the Bournes. The land itself was once home to the Ramaytush Ohlone people, whose presence stretches back thousands of years. New programs and partnerships seek to tell their stories, to reconnect this manicured space with the deeper, indigenous history of the land. A bridge on the estate's nature trail marks the crossing of the San Andreas Fault, reminding every visitor that this place is layered with history, tectonic, cultural, and human. Even now, Filoli remains a site of consequence. In November 2023, the estate hosted a diplomatic summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The moment, staged under heavy security but framed by tranquil gardens, placed Filoli again in the international spotlight. Images of the two leaders strolling past, clipped hedges and still fountains circulated across media outlets. The location choice was deliberate. It was neutral ground, timeless and peaceful, a place capable of softening hard conversations. That day, 400,000 annual visitors became millions watching from screens around the world. The house that William Bourne had built as a retreat from the world had, once again, become the world's stage. Yet for all its history, Filoli's most powerful presence may be its silence. The family cemetery is not part of the public tour. Few visitors know where it is, or who lies there. And yet, just beyond the walking paths and behind the clipped hedges, 4 graves sit. William Bowers, born 2. Agnes Moody, born. Maud Vincent, and the infant son who died in 1882. No grand markers, no monuments, just headstones among the trees. This is the paradox at the heart of Filoli. A grand estate built to resist time now serves as a shrine to what time inevitably takes. The Bournes are gone. The Roths are gone. Even most of the staff who once served in the estate's heyday are long past. But their vision, what they planted, built, and protected, remains. And what remains may be more important than what was ever possessed. Filoli is proof that beauty, when shared, survives. It is no longer about one family's status, but about a shared cultural inheritance. The act that ensured that survival was not Bourne's ambition, it was Lurline Roth's gift. By giving Filoli to the public, she allowed strangers to walk through William's dreams. She ensured that people from all walks of life could stand where he once stood and look out across the valley toward the sparkling reservoir. And what do they see? They see gardens that bloom beyond their lifetimes. They see a house that tells not just a story of wealth, but of loss, reinvention, and generosity. They see what happens when beauty is not hoarded, but shared. Because in the end, that's what Filoli teaches, whether in brick, flower, or silence. Some things are too beautiful to keep.